Well, Nancy Pelosi is in Taiwan, and this is somewhat of an unprecedented visit. The last time this high level of an official visited the island was when Newt Gingrich, who was speaker at the time, went in 1997. So this trip is certainly ruffling some feathers with China, whose leaders have warned Pelosi against going or else. Here's Chinese Ambassador Liu Jiaming saying, China has repeatedly made clear to the U.S. its serious concern over Pelosi's planned visit to Taiwan and its firm opposition to the visit. If the U.S. challenges China's red line, it will be met with resolute countermeasures. The U.S. must bear all consequences arising thereof. Yeah, that is not so good. So, in order for her to take this trip, the military has reportedly had to spend quite a bit of money, somewhere along the realm of $90 million in cash and resources to ensure her security. And some are warning that this could lead to an all-out war between the U.S. and China, which I don't think is likely, or that it might lead to China taking a more aggressive action against Taiwan, which I think is more likely. So it could end up being very similar to a situation that we're seeing in Russia and Ukraine, which, despite Western media claiming Ukraine is clobbering Russia, the reality is, while Zelensky is out posing for Vogue, he's also issuing evacuation orders for Ukrainians to leave areas of Ukraine because the Russians are taking over. So China could be making some calculations right now, thinking that they could invade Taiwan before the U.S. gets too cozy, like the U.S. did with Ukraine. And worst case scenario for them is the U.S. supplies weapons to Taiwan. They know we're not likely to go to war with them. The U.S. then makes Taiwanese people fight for themselves, like what we're doing to the Ukrainians. Meanwhile, China just takes over the island, which, by the way, would be a lot easier to take than a landlocked area like Ukraine. And by the way, I'm not advocating for any of these outcomes regarding Ukraine or Taiwan. I'm just laying out reality. China knows there'll be no war on their soil. They also know we're not going to go to war with them. So the worst case scenario from what they're seeing is we supply Taiwan with weapons. China would obviously lose a few soldiers, but they'd gain territory, just like what's happening in Ukraine. That's the calculation. Now, also, I should say, China doesn't view it as an invasion because they view Taiwan as part of their country, unlike Russia and Ukraine. I mean, yes, Ukraine was part of the USSR, but Russia knows it's a separate country. China, on the other hand, does not and has never recognized Taiwan as a separate country. It would be to them similar to if Texas tried to secede. The United States would never recognize Texas as a separate country, and if a foreign leader visited the Texas secessionists, the United States government would be extremely offended. Now, Caitlin Johnstone makes a good observation. Here's her tweet. The best case scenario for Pelosi's Taiwan visit is the absolute best case is that it ratchets up Cold War tensions with China that threatens us all and benefits ordinary people in no way. The worst case scenario is as bad as anything as you can possibly imagine. Right. So the worst case scenario being an all-out actual war between the United States and China, which I don't think is likely, but hey, stranger things have been happening lately. And the best case scenario from this visit is it pisses off China. They view us as a growing enemy and we go into a Cold War. The formation of AUKUS, the Australian, UK, US military alliance, which is similar to NATO but for the South China Sea, has already ratcheted up Cold War tensions between ourselves and China. So this visit just adds to it. And again, I don't think this leads to a war, but then again, I also didn't think Russia would invade Ukraine. So we could be at a point where the world is getting pretty fed up with US military aggression and our assertion that we run the world. So we very well may be at a point where Russia, China, Iran, and others get together and say, it's time to wage war. And we could see ourselves in an actual world war. We might be underestimating how pissed off these countries actually are, which makes sense because our Western media sugarcoats everything. Now, what is actually surprising is that Taiwan is going along with this after seeing what's going on in Ukraine. The U.S. has shown we're not going to war with a big country like China, just like we're not going to war with Russia. We made numerous promises to Ukraine that we had their back, and in the end, all we've done is supply them with weapons. We've not gone in to fight on their behalf. So it's a little bizarre to me that perhaps the Taiwanese government thinks they would somehow be different. But I guess in a way they are different. We do absolutely rely on their semiconductors. So maybe they're thinking we will go in and fight on their behalf. And who knows, maybe Nancy's visit has something to do with the fact that she and her husband have been heavily invested in semiconductors. I don't know. Taiwan is taking this threat pretty seriously, though. In preparation for Nancy's visit, they've been preparing themselves for potential war. Taiwan's National Palace Museum, which houses one of the world's finest collections of Chinese imperial relics, is actively considering how it would protect itself if Beijing launched an attack. The island is also, they've been testing missile warning sirens. Look at this. This is absolutely frightening. You know, we still have no real clear answers as to why Nancy Pelosi feels the need to visit Taiwan, increasing these tensions. Why now? I'm sure the military-industrial complex thinks it's a great idea. They'd like nothing more than another war or at least another Cold War. They've got weapons to sell. Now, you might be thinking it's Taiwan's right to have whomever they want to visit their country, that the people don't want to be taken over by China, and we shouldn't allow another regional bully to intimidate them. But it's actually more complicated than that. About half the country wants to be its own independent nation, and the other half would like to see reunification with China. In fact, one's preference for independence or unification with China is still the most important political question for voters. It isn't as cut and dry as Western media makes it sound. So this really is more of an internal dispute between Taiwan and China, which, by the way, Taiwan calls itself China, and mainland China, which also calls itself China, and the dispute being mainland's demand that the world recognize Taiwan as part of their country under their One China policy. And if you want to know where this stems from, it's from a civil war that sort of ended in the late 40s between the Chinese communists and the Chinese aristocratic government. The aristocrats ruled China until the communists ousted them. And when they were ousted, the government ran off to Taiwan, set up shop there, and refused to concede that they had lost the war. They instead insisted they were the true government of China, and that's why they still call themselves China. And after the ousting, the Western world had a tough time adapting, and the U.S. actually recognized the exiled government in Taiwan as the government of China until 1979, when the U.S. restored diplomatic relations with the mainland. And since then, it's been this odd relationship, sort of like walking a tightrope. The U.S. doesn't want to offend their longstanding friends, the aristocratic capitalist government of Taiwan, but also realizes the real power is on the mainland. The mainland government insists the aristocrats lost and are hellbound to get them to concede that loss at some point, which, funny, kind of reminds me of something else, right? So Pelosi going to visit Taiwan is like throwing sand in the face of China. It's her signaling that the diplomatic relations that were established in 1979 have grown cold. But she's not the first. She's actually acting very Trumpian. It was Trump who really got the ball started when he made a phone call to Taiwan's president, setting off criticisms. Remember that? That criticism mostly came from the left. This was in December of 2016 when he made that call. Many Republicans actually praised him. And now with this visit, it's looking like Democrats are joining Republicans. In fact, good old Newt Gingrich, who also broke precedent and made the trip himself, is encouraging Pelosi to go.
I was really surprised to realize that 1997 visit was the last time that a senior American leader had actually visited Taiwan. I encourage Nancy to go, particularly now that it's public. I think it would be humiliating and destructive if she were to back down. And I have to say, having a woke Defense Department that's not sure it can deal with the American speaker go to Taiwan makes you wonder what they would do in a real crisis.
I think this shows there really isn't a difference between the two establishment parties when it comes to foreign policy, war, and the military-industrial complex. They're both about flexing their muscles, not caring about the consequences, and certainly seeming to care more about what happens around the world rather than what's happening right here at home. I mean, just think about this. Why in the world is Nancy Pelosi fanning the flames that could potentially lead to a war at worst, or at best, China potentially cuts us off from trade or raises prices when we're in the middle of unprecedented inflation? And the truth is, our government leaders don't really care about we, the American people. They're not looking out for what's best for us, the middle class, Ukrainians, or even the people of Taiwan. They don't really care about the little people, the people who are impacted the most and harmed the most by these reckless antics and policies. Their job, and unfortunately what they're paid to do by their big money donors, is to protect corporate interests. And there are a lot of corporate interests in Taiwan, in particular in the semiconductor industry. Those industries want protection from a China takeover. That's what this visit is really about. It's about signaling to corporations that they're being protected by the U.S. military. Our military is rarely ever used to do things like protect human rights or save lives as much as they claim it. It's really used to protect corporate interests. That's been true since the beginning, when the Navy was formed to protect merchant ships. And everyone should just understand what's really happening. This isn't about the freedom of the people of Taiwan. Our politicians are willing to risk harming average Americans and sacrificing Taiwanese lives to protect corporate interests, just like they're doing in Ukraine. Our leaders are reckless when it comes to foreign policy. And this trip by Nancy at a time like this, when Americans are suffering, is making that recklessness glaringly obvious. When will we Americans say, this is it, we've had enough?